Okay, this is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, broadcast number 627, and we're almost winding down the year December the 12th, 1983. Regarding the Rebel magazine, which came out, and I've talked about it in anticipation, there are problems with the Rebel. I knew there would be. There is an executive editor, Jim Good, and there is a senior editor, Mark Cooper, who thought that Larry Flynt was sufficiently tucked away that they could mess around with Mae Brussell. Larry started the magazine and wanted me to have one issue every month, and I made about 40 phone calls to Los Angeles that weren't returned, asking the deadline or the subject matter for Jim as soon as the Nazi story was finished. It turns out I don't believe that Jim or Mark had any intention of printing me unless they had to, and they knew that Larry had problems. The reason I know it is that I never got a return call on the subject, what of the three subjects, and I went ahead and did the Grenada invasion, which is a major political event in the United States with its links to Robert Vesco, Ramsey Clark, Edward Bennett Williams, Mr. Califano, Ronald Reagan, Caspar Weinberger, The Garden Plot. I have evolved a script that is fantastic, and I'll do more on it next week. I said I'm going to do Grenada, and there was this dead silence. I took the first manuscript down before Thanksgiving, and they said, rewrite this or that. I came home and worked, and these gentlemen did not respond, did not answer calls, and intended, along with Ted Rubenstein, he knew what was going on down there, intended to go to press without Mae in the second issue. My script was ready, and I was working here and there, and they decided that they would fool Mae and Larry Flynt and not print it. And Larry is out of the mental hospital that the COINTEL program slapped on him, I believe the MK Ultra treatment that we've talked about on the air. He called me yesterday. I was surprised he was home, and I said I would meet with him tomorrow, and we would talk about what happened in Los Angeles. It's controversial. These people are not in good faith. They do not like Mae. The team was stacked with people who do not like my exposing both the Democrats and the Republicans, the Ramsey Clarks, the Bernard Cords, the Vesco connections, and also Mark Cooper was put on Rebel by Don Freed. Don Freed suggested him to Larry Flynt. Don Freed, the writer, his attorney for his lawsuit, he was sued by the CIA and Mr. Phillips regarding the book he did on Orlando Letelier's murder. The attorney for Don Freed happens to be Ramsey Clark. Ramsey Clark is the attorney for Bernard Cord, who killed Maurice Bishop down in Grenada. And this week on NBC News, they announced that Robert Vesco was funding Bernard Cord $45,000 and also put the money up to build the airstrip in Grenada that was excused for the invasion of the island. The plans to take over the island were in 1979 in March, as soon as Sir Eric Gary goes to the United Nations where Peter Byrne is and says, take me to your friend Jimmy Carter. We'll do more of that on the air as this goes on, and you'll get that story. It's a dynamite story, but these people that were assigned, put in there, they can't tell me there's no conflict of interest because a listener, subscriber to World Watchers took to KPFA, Pacifica Station in Los Angeles, my tapes, copies of my tapes, and Mark was news director of the station. He never would put them on, wouldn't listen, totally censored. This is the important thing when I talk about raising money for Kazoo and your listener-sponsored stations that carry World Watchers. There are stations like Pacifica stations that screen out any connections to Nazis, organized crime, the Vesco connections, and the Edward Bennett Williams to Califano, to Peter Byrne, to Ramsey Clark, the whole gang. And it is a very heavy story. Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General when Martin Luther King was killed, and he said the very next day, April the 6th, it's a lone assassin, no Klan member, nobody from organized crime. Now, James Earl Ray said he was involved with Mr. Youngblood, who came from Atlanta, Georgia. And Youngblood worked with Mr. Habash and Larry McDonald and the same people that Robert Byron Watson talked about. And they also tie into the Grenada story with Robert Vesco and the mob down in that island, securing that island for the mob and for resorts like Resorts International and so forth. So I will be talking to Larry Flynt about that by the time next week's program is on. I'll share this with you. Another condition I have to have with Rebel, if I'm going to write any more for them, is that I will do not one story a week, but one long story every month, like the JFK and the Nazis. I'll do a equivalent of a 50 typewritten page on the Grenada invasion. I turned in a 22-page. I want the whole ball of wax of all these various interlocking conspiracies, even going into the John Hinckley family and Edward Bennett Williams and George Bush, who was CIA director when the medical school started down there, and also was the CIA director when Orlando Letelier was murdered. I want to do one story a month, one cover story, a big story. And the other condition of Rebel, if I'm to have my name, they have a list of contributors, contributing editors there, and it says Mae Brussell, Jeff Cohn, Don Freed, Timothy Leary, Jonathan Marshall, and so forth. I will not be in the company of Timothy Leary or G. Gordon Liddy. They've put, Jim Good has brought G. Gordon Liddy to Rebel to write book reviews on people on the Kennedy assassination. If they can't tell their background or involved with the conspirators and offer anything new, I won't be on any publication list with any bunch of killers or dope dealers or mind-controlled distributors. I don't keep that kind of company. You know, Sartre was the existential philosopher, said you don't begin to live until you're not afraid to die. And I carried another step further. You don't begin to live until you're not afraid to be broke. And I've done a lot of things to keep myself going on the edge. And sometimes you end up with $10 a month and at the end of the month, or you borrow 10. And all last year, the year before, I was cooking for a family in Pebble Beach. Before that, I took care of a blind lady 3 days a week, and I'd go in and cook 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, and bring in the food, cook their meals, and leave. They'd have enough for the whole week. I don't mind that. I like that. That's the kind of job I like to do. I do it well. There's no amount of money that will keep me with Rebel, with Jim Good or Mark Cooper, unless Larry Flynt and I sit down this week and talk to them. And also, another point is that I mentioned on there that Larry Flynt ran that ad about $1 million reward for information on the assassinations. Those people have to bring it to me to screen through and not to Jim Good, because he hands it to G. Gordon Liddy. And that is treason. It is traitorous to sit with those kind of people. And if Larry doesn't understand that sophisticated concept, it doesn't matter. I never knew Larry Flynt before September when I offered to do a story with him on Larry McDonald. And we can remain good friends. I have a lot of friends or associates that I don't have any business dealings with of any kind. And I can always be his friend, and I appreciate the fact that he had the courage to publish in the Rebel what he did, and it took courage, believe me. But beyond that, I have no obligation, no signed contract. He called and he was outraged. He says, "You're my best researcher." Well, I feel I am, and he appreciates that. But I won't deal with Liddy, G. Gordon Liddy, or Timothy Leary, or any of those scumbags, Mitchell Werbell or Gordon Novell, or any of them. If he wants to deal with them, they bankrupt him, got him to spend all his money, got him acting crazy in front of the news media. That's his problem. That isn't mine. Before I knew him, he was sane and well. And when you mingle with these kind of people, those are the risks you take. That's the way the cookie crumbles. But it's not my problem. And I just like to do investigative work, and I don't want to mingle with the likes of these people. So, and then another thing is, besides giving information to them, the intent was to have a magazine where new researchers who maybe done work for 10, 20, 30 years, who aren't known, whose names are not household words, like George Seldes, who's written so many books and gotten out, in fact, an older man. You may have seen just a shot of him in the movie Reds, but they didn't even identify his picture with his name. And I hated that, too. That's a cheap stunt to not give a man the pleasure of recognition before he dies, and he's an elderly gentleman living in New England. We should have George Seldes' material that he published years ago into Rebel. We don't need Timothy Leary with his old, worn-out stories about disseminating his acid. He didn't have a license to do that. During these years, if you gave acid to somebody, you could be busted and arrested. When he gives it, he calls it turning on, and he gets $100,000 a year just to speak or get a movie or a radio station. I don't want any part of those people, and I want to know who's answering the ads, and I want the manuscripts. Jim Good got a manuscript, a report from Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. He returns it with a kill fee of $175. Sherman has worked his whole entire life to overturn the courts, to expose the mob, the criminal. He did extensive work with the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, the Nazis with John Hinckley Jr. He had polio when he was a young man, and he's crippled, paraplegic. He goes out cold nights, days and nights, goes to bat for anybody, goes to libraries, copies things, doesn't have a copying machine at home, works his entire life serving this country, one of the best patriots we have. And the intent of Larry Flynt was that these people would be heard and become known in their lifetime. Now, I told Larry Flynt about Sherman Skolnick, and the minute he was in trouble with the Supreme Court, Larry was in trouble there, and he was assigned to Judge Shapiro, who worked with the CIA and the mob, or alleged, I'll say, not for sure, because I don't want to get sued by Judge Shapiro. Let's say that Mr. Sherman Skolnick had information about things in Chicago that should be questioned about the lawyer Shapiro, not necessarily assigned to the Larry Flynt case, just as the lawyer who was assigned to the Larry Flynt case, the judge, was the CIA attorney for Chicago, Illinois, and was the CIA attorney at the time that Sam Giancana and Jack Ruby from Chicago worked with organized crime and the CIA and had a part in the killing of John Kennedy. That's the judge whose eye he spit in when he was in Chicago. I mean, I think it's too bad he got this rap, but spitting in the eye of that bomb, it would be a pleasure. I wish I had a chance to do it, but maybe not in the court, maybe off court. Okay. So Skolnick, I got a call, and Larry Flynt was in trouble. Skolnick went down with his wheelchair, and wheelchair by wheelchair, they sat, and he went to bat for him, pushed his way in, had a press conference, kept Larry's name in the news, maybe saved his life. He had word that some mishap was going to happen in there involving a doctor from New York, and I called out California, the Flint House, and we got people there moving 1, 2, 3, and moving really fast into the case, and nothing happened. And there aren't many people in the world that go to bat for you, put their life on the line. So at 2 a.m, armchair by armchair, and Larry Flynt is saying to Sherman, I think they're going to kill me in here. Well, Sherman kept that thing on his radio. He kept it going, and he let the world know, and he called the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun. He called the FBI. And Larry Flynt had a little army, and then I talked about it, called Washington, called the White House. They said call the White House, called the FBI about what he was publishing and doing. And the result was that he's alive and home. And if they touched him, and I was talking about this MK Ultra drugging of him, then we could get back to all the back tapes and play it. So what does Jim Good down there? He returns the manuscript. I don't know if it was readable or not, but with a good editor or reader, I have someone here, we can write it so it's presentable, and it would, I know, would be new material. And we don't need the Timothy Learys who take a section out of an old book that anybody can buy for a quarter at a book sale anyway and sell it for $2.95 in the Rebel. Larry Flynt has friends out there. He's got a lot of people that would go to bat for him. And I'm going to see that Jim Good doesn't screen them out, or that nasty Mark Cooper. If they want to, they can do what they want, and I'm out of it completely. It was a nice experience. I did one article, and hopefully the next week or two, in my story on Grenada and the interlocking links of, as I say, George Bush and Califano and Edward Bennett Williams and the CIA, the medical hospital, the mental experiments, I'll put it together for you in a way that makes sense, and Larry Flynt will publish it, and those two guys can shove it. They won't like it because their role is to keep this stuff out, and so we'll see what goes on. That's what's going on at the Rebel, and if you can go and buy it anywhere in the country while it's still there, do it. It'll be a collector's item someday, and when it's out of print this next week, when the next one comes out, I'll try and obtain copies so that you can order them for me. But I want you to buy them from the liquor stores, the bookstores, and support them and buy it off the stand so that they know you want it. But Rebel 2 and 3, I'm Mae Brussell isn't in there. You can buy it if you want it. The address, you have it inside your other Rebel if you got it. And Larry Flint's address, I'll put on the air next week. You can write and tell him that you don't appreciate the censorship of Jim Good or Mark Cooper. I don't want to give you the office at Century City because I don't think it'll get to him. If they censor us now, they'll censor it later. And I'll give you Larry Flint's home address. I didn't bring it with me. He said in the opening introduction, the first magazine, the government, in particular the Reagan administration, is determined to stifle independent voice. Like in this magazine, it is dedicated to exposing lies, our working tools of the big government and business, whether the subject is secret little murderous wars being hatched in the Pentagon or CIA headquarters, Pentagon or CIA. That's Defense Department. That's one step higher because everyone blames the CIA usually. Or government frame-up of those who speak out, or the cozy relationship between the mob and groups of elected officials, or the multi-million-dollar rip-offs and fraud perpetuated against the American people. The rebel will be relentless in exposing the real facts. Now, people like Sherman Skolnick have been doing all of that, and then he gets a check back. No, thank you. Up yours. We don't want you. Bring on Leary and G. Gordon Liddy. No, it's not going to be that way. Not with Mae Brussell. I am satisfied to do just what I do, and I think I do it well, and share it with you listeners on this station and on other stations, or people, private people who subscribe to these tapes. And we'll update more. I'll give you an account of what happened in Los Angeles when I met with Larry Flint and see what goes on. And, of course, if I'm in the home in Gordon Novell and G. Gordon Lee, I don't think you'll have them there. I wouldn't go in. Okay. Now let's update a little bit of the news real fast that's going on, the rest of the news of the week. But this is very important. The situation of a man creating a method for people to get information out, and then his own team come in and with no intent of allowing this to continue because he's out of sight and out of mind. So if he were there, it wouldn't have happened. And so we'll see how far they can go and what they intend to do if he has control. This is Jim Good is the fellow that chopped up my article on the 007, and Larry was so furious because he had really emasculated and changed the intent and the title and took every juicy part out of it. And Larry said, I'm putting the whole thing in. And it's in the February Hustler right now. Okay, now to update a few interesting stories. There's one on John DeLorean. The officials are still trying to trace DeLorean's millions. I update this every once in a while. This is from the Houston Post. They're looking in England. They're looking in Detroit. They can't find where the money went. There's a lot of money, $15.5 million, that went to Lotus Car that came from Panama. Now, what I keep saying, this Panama registered company, the GPD Services. I keep saying, and I've had it on the air for the last 4 or 5 months, that from sources that have been very accurate, former writers, investigators, the plane pilots, they told me that this DeLorean cash went down to Klaus Barbie, you remember the broadcast, and then went into a Swiss bank where the attorney of Joseph Mengele deposited it. Now, up to that point, I've called Detroit, I've called the FBI, I've called a lawyer in Miami with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. They reach a block. They just simply cannot find this money. And if the Klaus Barbie connections are true, they never will find it because they can't admit that John DeLorean was dealing with Klaus Barbie just a month or prior before Barbie was arrested, because then that opens up the Johnny Carson and the Robert Durant and the Jack Catane, the Hollywood cocaine connections to the Nazis and Klaus Barbie. Then we would open up and investigate very highly the Christian vonDamm, the husband of Helene vonDamm, the Bank of America in Bolivia, and the connections of the Chase Manhattan Bank to this whole thing. There's a can of worms that gets into the very backbone of America. This is the United States of America, and when you get to that level, there's no way to tell the truth, and there's no way to cover it. So it seeps out. It's like some bad chemical that they throw into the sewer system, and it seeps, and everybody gets poisoned a little until they finally have to admit what the problem was. Incidentally, I mentioned on the half hour before World Watchers started, and I want to repeat it here, that 2 members of a congressional committee were at my home yesterday. This is for the people who get the broadcast elsewhere that didn't get to hear this. And we went over the history of Fritz Kramer, and I took the sheet of every broadcast that accompanies these broadcasts with the sources of information and gave it to them and followed the American Fritz Kramer and a little about Hitler's Fritz Kramer. They're out here looking for a specific congressional committee on the war criminals that came to the United States. And I want to be very sure in my mind and for you that prisoner number 33 in the docket at Malmedy, charged with the Malmedy massacres, tried at Dachau, released by Senator Joe McCarthy. I want to make sure that that's not the Fritz Kramer behind Henry Kissinger, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, who has run our Pentagon since 1948, the Plans Department of the Pentagon, who now shares an office with Daniel Graham of High Frontier and John Reese of Western Goals and the highest level of military intelligence. Now, I've gone almost as far. I can keep going and writing letters to various agencies. And I got some more information from a listener in New York that I'll put on the air probably next week on Fritz Kramer. But on the basis of what I've done, I want them to pursue this on specific areas, and they're looking into them. The main one was Hitler's Fritz Kramer is in a few history books at the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive, with Mr. Dietrich and some of the top generals, Mr. Monkey, the head of the Death's Head. But I don't know what books of German history or war that Kramer was in, what battle, whether he was with Rommel in the desert, whether he was in Poland or near Minsk, Russia, or whether he's in Czechoslovakia. I can't believe that Hitler has a general that just becomes a general in 1944 and is there for one battle and then gets on the staff of General Patton, along with little young Henry Kissinger as the teacher or tutor in the gang at Oberammergau after the war. So I'm wanting, going through several hundreds of books on the war, can't locate anything, German Documentation Center from Munich or from Berlin or from the Holocaust Center or from Palestine, where this guy of Hitler's was until the middle of 1944 and the end of 1944, December, for that battle. Where in the world was he before he became a general? And if we can't find him anywhere, then they have to ask Mr. Kissinger's Kramer under oath, and I gave them a list of questions, and just to say it's not him isn't enough. We have to know what cities and so forth he was in. So because of this radio program, World Watchers, listeners had written letters to Congress, members of Congress, about my work looking for this particular Nazi and some others. And then I think the letter sat there maybe for a while, and I think it was written a little while ago. Then Larry Flynt sent 2 tapes, one on Fritz Kramer, particularly in Daniel Graham, with their office number and phone number to every member of Congress. And he sent broadcast 6, 17, 18. I've talked about those. And so the combination of sharing this publicly with you makes it harder for them to cover it up, because they know on the air that you are like my family. I talk to you and I make broadcasts as if you were calling my house and talking on the telephone. It's a very personal communication, and many of you I've known for so long, you are really closer than most members of my family. So I have no secrets, and I'm not waiting for a punchline to publish a book. The book runs every week, and I'm letting you know about it. So the DeLorean millions, if it goes to Klaus Barbie, then it would go to Christian vonDamm and Henry Kissinger again with Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia after he had Klaus Barbie in Oberammergau. So I'm interested in these stories on tracing the money because they just simply can't find it. And it's been a year this January. There was a story in the Oregon paper a listener sent me when Larry Flynt flew up there to Klamath Falls. I mentioned this ingredient that he had that he was going to take to cure urine drop-off. It said he was traveling with an entourage of 35 people and stopped at Klamath Municipal Airport to pick up blue-green manna and flew again. He was going to pick up Victor Coleman, Kollman, a Klamath Fall biochemist who developed the algae extract. You notice he's not a doctor, no medical school or any degree behind that. He's the one who disseminates these pills and these drops that Larry Flynt gave to me, and he was taking them, and I would say to him on the telephone, who's going crazy, you or me? Now, I'm not accusing Victor Coleman of anything in those little drops, but even if they're innocent drops and they're at Larry's house, you can put something in the drops because you know he's going to take them, right? He gets up in the morning, bring me my drops, and then you put it in the drops because he's taking 4 or 5 every few hours. No, thank you. That's where they come from Klamath Falls. And somebody did tell me that they were made in Atlanta, Georgia, and I want to check that out with him and tell him he should not disseminate any substance to put in anybody's mouth. We should decide for ourselves what we take in our mouth. And I'm not saying this guy is part of any big conspiracy, but as I've told you before, it just isn't safe to put this stuff into your mouth. And he should have known that. If he's going to be so political, he should have known that a while back. Another incident that was in the Houston Post was Larry Flynt was indicted with the U.S. flag incident, and it said the criminal complaint against him wearing that flag in court, and Mitchell Werbel, this high man from the Defense Department, was with him, and of course, not much was made of that, was signed by Jerry West, the same FBI agent who arrested John DeLorean. So not only was he there because of the DeLorean tapes, but this incident was causing him a lot of pain, a lot of economic problems, and the same guy was tagging him. Now, there was another story this week. Larry Flynt named the source of the DeLorean tape that allegedly now has been altered and forged, and evidently the federal officials, or rather Mr. Hoffman, Timothy Hoffman, working for them, they didn't threaten to kill his child. I think the tapes were altered. And there were stories in the UPI, San Jose Mercury, Flynt names reporter source of tapes. And then it mentions that Gordon Novell, he mentioned a government agent, he says, was given him by Gordon Novell, a New Orleans businessman who had extensive contact with John DeLorean and also with columnist Jack Anderson, who had the same tapes. Now, there's another story in the Los Angeles Herald, Louisianan source of DeLorean tape, ? This was on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, November 22nd, 1983. A government investigation is going to Gordon Novell, who had contacts with Jack Anderson. And remember, Jack Anderson's strong ties with Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorina, who's involved with the Kennedy assassination. And Anderson's involved with close to Novell. It said Novell has been identified as a former private eye, a gun dealer, a promoter, prosecuted several times by Louisiana authorities in a strange case involving a firebomb, conspiracy to firebomb part of New Orleans with balloons. The conviction was overturned. He was wanted by Jim Garrison in New Orleans. I've mentioned that. Pardon me, regarding the Kennedy assassination. And he currently was at the Larry Flynt mansion. I don't know if he's still there now. And it says that Gordon Novell talked with DeLorean by phone several times, visited him in his New Jersey home. See how they cooked this up. They get Larry Flynt in trouble and try to get the DeLorean case thrown out because the government wants it thrown out anyway. And it tells about Novell's contacts in 1961. He was involved with the operations with the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Theodore Shackley. Novell was arrested in New Orleans in 1976, conspiracy to commit arson. He was transferred to the state courts there. And they have his role as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination and firebombing, and also his scandalous police record. And for some reason or other, Larry Flynt thinks that he's going to take this CIA criminal electronics expert with his past track record on his camp to be a security guard. I mean, oh my gosh. Can you imagine amassing a fortune, being so brilliant, making it in the American system, accumulating so much, and then losing it because these people have framed you? I remember about 3 months ago, in the middle of September, I believe, when he was going to have lunch with the attorney Greg Boutzer. And I said, don't do that. I mean, for goodness sakes, don't do that. And I think we might be able to date when his troubles began. I don't know what was discussed at lunch. He went. But everyone he wanted to see it, including Boutzer, I said no, and he went deeper into the trap. Now, on the anniversary of John Kennedy's death, I wanted to have a press conference in front of Larry Flynt's house. In fact, I called the L.A. Times. Larry turned out to be in Dallas. And I wanted to tell them to have Mr. Mitchell Werbel and Gordon Novell tell who killed Kennedy, because they would know. And here's a interesting contradiction of the event or events that should be checked out. Bob Cutler has spent endless years and written a book on Gordon Novell as being the umbrella man, with a picture of him shooting a flechette, a small missile, into the throat of John Kennedy, holding the umbrella weapon, which the CIA confirmed they had, and these small missiles, as being the man who was responsible for this missile in Kennedy's throat. Now, Larry Flynt was offering $1 million reward on the anniversary of Kennedy's death to solve the mystery. And Bob Cutler printed a book that the man who did the murder was the one in Larry Flynt's house on that exact day. Now, it's 30 minutes. We'll take a 1-minute break now and then come back for some more of this story. I think this is an interesting story about Novell being in the home of Larry Flynt because it's the anniversary of Kennedy's death. On the anniversary of Kennedy's death, November 22nd, comes an article that Novell is at the mansion of Larry Flynt, living there and working for him and offering a reward for somebody who killed him. Now, if Novell really did it, it seems to me, if Bob Cutler is right, I'll go back with this after 1 minute. We'll take a pitch first for 1 minute. I usually do ask you to contribute to the station before we go on to the second half of World Watch. This is a fundraising week. And now we'll begin with side 2 of broadcast number 627, December the 12th, 1983. Novell would have been very nice. He should have said to Larry Flynt, hey, I'll take the $1 million, Larry, instead of working for so much a month. I'll tell you about what happened to John Kennedy, and they'll give me immunity, and then the case will be over. We won't have to worry about it. The case closed, okay? This book on Bob Cutler goes extensively into radio shows he's done, pictures and diagrams, the documentation of the fact that the CIA doesn't have an umbrella, how the umbrella was opened, the use of Gordon Novell, and he's got a picture of him sitting on the curb and headshots and overlays, and he has met him personally and said, I believe you are the umbrella man who sent this missile into Kennedy, and the first autopsy at Parkland Hospital described a missile in Kennedy's throat. Incidentally, the book that Bob Cutler did on Gordon Novell tells about his working for Double Check Corporation in Miami, and in Rebel, the article I wrote for Larry Flynt, I talk about Double Check, briefly mentioned it, and part of Guy Bannister and the Permindex operation, one of the assassination teams. There were mentions of Mitchell Bourbell and also Gordon Novell. In this article tells how he worked for Schlumberger Well Company, and Mr. Jean de Menil, M-E-N-I-L, was an associate of George de Mohrenschildt. In the Rebel, I was writing about George de Mohrenschildt and his links at Nazi connections to John Kennedy. I'm publishing an article that Larry's getting out on the Kennedy assassination, and the people I'm writing about, again, are in the House. Now, this book that Bob Cutler did goes into the role of Guy Bannister with his Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean that was set up by Charles Willoughby that I wrote about in the Rebel. And it tells about Bannister as associated with Office of Naval Intelligence as well as with Lee Harvey Oswald. And, of course, Oswald's role in the Navy intelligence was with John Connolly and Fred Korth, both Secretary of the Navy, in their context to Oswald. So in this book about Gordon Novell and the missile removed from John Kennedy's throat, the testimony of the CIA that they do have a umbrella weapon. They have a cane, and they have a walking cane, and they also have an umbrella, which is a weapon. And the description of the weapon, the man, and so forth. I believe you can get this book from research out in Aptos, California, and I've given you the address. I didn't bring it tonight. I'll bring it another time. The Day of the Umbrella Man by Bob Cutler. It's all about Gordon Novell and the missile and John Kennedy, and that's the man who was at Larry's house and still maybe paid by him. And this is one reason why we have to have a nice talk, and maybe May has to reevaluate. You know, when I went on, this team wasn't there, and there's no reason why I can't leave the ship and leave it while I'm ahead. Bob Cutler has done extensive work. He's a Harvard graduate and almost retired architect who has spent a tremendous long time investigating this incident. Now, there's been a long ad in the newspapers in Washington, D.C. I don't know how many of you have seen it. A full ad on an ambassador to the Vatican with a question mark. Should the president appoint an ambassador to the Vatican? And there were several articles this past week. Reagan making new push to formal ties with the Vatican. The opponents say it would be unfair to favor the Catholics. Another one, the U.S. explores closer Vatican relations. Now, this is literally an emergency, and I'm going to give you the address of a church group. You can write to, write to Public Affairs and Religious Liberty, 6840 Eastern Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20012, or telephone 202-722-6688. They claim that there should be separation of church and state, that is very imperative that we separate and not have an ambassador going back and forth. Now, Licio Gelli was at Ronald Reagan's administration and funded Ronald Reagan and works with Alexander Haig and Michael Lundin and the entire Center for Strategic Study. He's a bigwig in Washington, and he's now in Argentina. He fled from a Swiss jail. He was a man who worked for Franco. He set up the equivalent of the Gestapo for the Italian, for Mussolini, and then he ran Hitler. He worked for Hitler's Nazis in Italy when Mussolini fell. And then he fled to Argentina and came back to Italy and had the notorious P2 Masonic scandal with 1,000 members of the government that were ready to put in a Nazi dictatorship in Italy. And the present Pope works with Hermann Abst of the Vatican. He works with the Vatican Bank, and Abst was the head of the Deutsche Bank and IG Farben, and made Zyklon B, the gas for the concentration camps. And to send an ambassador from just the Vatican, which is just a few miles large, to Washington, D.C., gives an exchange going back and forth. And I'm sure that Michael Sindona wants this, too. He built the Watergate Hotel. The Vatican had their investment, put that up. Sindona is in jail for breaking down not only the Franklin National Bank for $45 million, but banks in Europe, and funded, closely tied to Richard Nixon, the Republican Party. There's an element of fascism and far right-wing Nazis, actual Nazis, not neos from the First War. And it's very important to separate, because then the money can flow back and forth to get them out of bail. The Vatican was caught with $1.2 billion in the Bahamas and Panama dummy fronts linked to drug smuggling and to weapons smuggling. And how to extend the Vatican to the White House is to open the door then to one church group. I can't think of any other single church group that's been identified and proven in the courts to have this notorious record with coming down politically on every priest or Jesuit who wants to make social change. So starting with Pius XII, who was actually funding Hitler, just putting the money in his hand, and Mussolini and Franco. If you want fascism and you want them to have bagmen running in and out of the rooms, the ambassadors, two-way running in and out, instead of isolating them until they come forward with where the money went. There's 10 dummy fronts, 10 doorknobs with no buildings, with several $100 million. If you don't want to know where that went, okay. But if it's going to buy fascism, to buy newspapers, to take away your rights, it's important to separate that. The Bonn, Germany had an article this week. West German Nazis vow they will rise again. There's a party starting up meeting in Munich. If you have unlimited money, you can rise again. That's easy. There's no problem with that. Now, in the remaining time, I want to talk about provocations, because in the article on Larry McDonald that's in Hustler this month, it brings up the question of mind control of the pilots flying the 007. And this article is the first article published to suggest what happened to this particular plane that was sabotaged. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, a member of the CIA said that Ronald Reagan literally provoked this to increase the war tension and the anti-communism. And he's 20 years with the CIA, 25 years. And there are all kinds of theories on the 007, but not one of them, and I brought in some of them to share with you tonight, can come up with any logical explanation that's any better than the one that is in the Hustler, the February Hustler on Murder Incorporated. And incidentally, the Larry McDonald pie there covers two sections of Larry McDonald's complicated life, the 007 and Western Goals and the LAPD. But when I get to the Grenada story, we'll go to other sections of the Larry McDonald pie and the John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy murder and so forth. It all ties into these people. Now, after that came out, we heard the word kamikaze, which we haven't heard since World War II. Hardly the Japanese troops in the news everywhere. And there's a story this week. Reagan voices his concern over kamikaze terrorists. And he refers to the brain-controlled terrorists that bombed the embassy in Lebanon. And the word kamikaze, San Jose Mercury and Washington Post, big black letters. It was never really mentioned before. There's provocations going on now, and the word is terrorism. And one good way to lose your rights is to get sucked into terrorism. Ronald Reagan is turning Washington into an armed camp with cement barriers, electronic devices, missiles at the airport, turning us into a state of terrorism. And at the same time, he worked with Ramsey, Clark, and Califano, the people involved with the Grenada government, and Robert Vesco on that notorious garden plot. When Reagan was governor of California, it was a plan laid out by the Pentagon in Georgia to overthrow this country called the Garden Plot. And I can go back and pull that out and share that with you. And looking at my Grenada articles, there's Califano, who Sir Eric Gary went to when he was kicked out by Maurice Bishop, and says, help me overthrow Bishop. And Califano and Hagen, Kissinger, and Carrington go into shift gear and do that. And Ramsey Clark is the attorney for Cord, who killed Maurice Bishop. And they were in the Garden Plot. So the level of terrorism to overthrow the country isn't very far away from Ronald Reagan's past as governor with the same teams. Now he's president of the United States. And Pravda had an article this week. They said that U.S. imperialism is the leading suppressor of human rights and freedom, and accused the Reagan administration of raising terrorism to the level of official policy. Now, some of you don't remember, you don't have a recall, or you weren't here, but take your 8 years in California with the SLA, the Simonese Liberation Army, the Manson family, the Isla Vista, the People's Park, the San Quentin killing of George Jackson, the Marin County, the judge, the San Quentin 6 trial, the Soledad brothers down here, the mutiny trial of the soldiers that came down to Fort, or down here in California near Carmel. It's right outside of Carmel. We had an experiment on the mini garden plots, and the LAPD was involved in all that, and LAPD is in charge of the security for the Olympic Games. And so the Soviet Union is saying that we're making this official policy. Now, what kind of provocations have we had? For example, here's a story out of the New York Times, big black letters in the LA Herald. The United States overlooked the Beirut warning. They had letters 1 inch high. Secret bulletin predicted the attack. Another article, it's by Philip Talman, but down in, this is a reprint from the San Jose Mercury. U.S. intelligence warned the Marine Beirut hit likely. Why did that happen? That happened one day after the Grenada invasion, and they had 3 days warning. They knew the Grenada invasion was coming down because they planned it carefully in escalated stages from 1980 up to 83, and they synchronized a day apart. And just shortly after the Korean Airline, which was September the 1st, and then the killing of the Koreans in Burma. Another story in the San Francisco Chronicle by General John Vesey, Jr., the head of the Army. U.S. still doesn't know who bombed the Marine base in Beirut. The reason they don't know is that I think Ronald Reagan had this as a major provocation, like our California violences, simultaneous within 24 hours to the Grenada. Now, the New Times, a magazine that comes out weekly from the Soviet Union, went into the provocations of the South Koreans killed in Burma. And they called it a provocation and an excuse for a declaration of war. Remember when Mr. Ajah was shooting at the Pope and the Pope had died? It would have been an excuse for a war invasion into Bulgaria and the Soviet Union. The New Times explains that the president of South Korea rearranged the motorcade, it sounds a little bit like Dallas, and changed the time and day and had what he called a miraculous escape. That Chun Do-Wan, H-W-A-N, set the arrival a few minutes different than the others so that he survived it and called it divine intervention. They brought out another point that he sent people down there ahead of time and after they made the arrangements and carefully told them, what time or where at this particular monument with wreath would be put down. Then he himself knew in advance there'd be an explosion, they said, because then after it was carefully arranged, he changed it. And then they brought out the fact that within a few hours after the cabinet shifted and they changed the entire cabinet after the shooting, he had people appointed immediately, and it would be impossible to lose 6 or 7 people of your cabinet and then have a new cabinet appointment right on the spot from the moment they're dead. It was like Lyndon Johnson making sure that his CIA friend, Judge Sarah Hughes, made him president within an hour after Kennedy was dead. She happens to be a lifelong friend of his and from the CIA, and she's holding the Bible. Now, down in Burma with this South Korean incident, they go on to explain that when the cabinet changed, the major change took place, but the two people he didn't change were the chief of the National Security Agency and his own bodyguards. And if they were remiss in all this, they would have been off. So when a newspaper article says there was a confession down there, it doesn't mean anything necessarily. There was a confession in El Salvador about the killing of an American GI, and then it came out about a week and a half ago that he was forced and tortured into a confession. And then they're giving the men the death penalty, so you'll never know whether or not it was a provocation. Now, in Washington, the FBI says the Capitol bombings are like other blasts, and they refer to an armed resistance group. That's like the Symbionese Liberation Army. We spent $22 billion a year for intelligence between the defense and the CIA, Navy intelligence, $22 billion. And isn't it funny that every incident that could cause World War III or set off some terrible repressions and instigations is never heard of by anybody before? It's like in California, the SLA, the Venceremos was infiltrated, the United Prisoners Union was infiltrated, the Panthers was infiltrated, the women's organizations, and then all of a sudden, the Symbionese creature pops out of nowhere. And in Washington, it's called the Arms Resistance Unit. So on the basis of a bombing where a few art pictures went down and nobody was hurt, they are, there's a picture of the Capitol policemen with metal detectors. There were sandbags. There's new X-ray machines added to security buildings, concrete barriers, and the latest is missiles at the airport that can shoot with 1 minute any airplane that they think would be going into the White House that lands at an airport in New York. So the story is explosion rocks Capitol, causes no injuries. And in return, the Capitol of the United States of America, never before, is an armed camp, so that you get a warfare mentality. If he pulls the garden plot with his Ramsey Clarks and Califanos and so forth, and Mr. Beckwith and the whole Olympic gang, if they have one incident and pull the martial law plan, they have all the barriers so you can't get in there, and he is protected in advance. Now, as far as the Korean Airline, to update the article that is in the Hustler on the Korean Airline, a few items. The U.S. taxpayers spent, was it $500 million or $50 million? I forget the exact figure. I didn't look it up, for the Glomar Explorer. Remember how they brought up a Russian ship and gave them a service and then dropped them back in the ocean? It scrapes the bottom of the earth and moves around. Well, when they were looking for the Korean Airline, the Glomar was going to rest. Now, they've put it at the end of its line. It served 15 years. The taxpayers paid for it, but they didn't send it to the waters off of Japan and Korea to find that airline. Why? Because the machinery would show it was a spy ship with the cameras maybe floating. So instead of using what the taxpayers paid for to pick up the Glomar, they're going to dry dock it now and take it apart, because the evidence they find may show what the Korean Airline was doing. Another story from the New York Times that updates a computer input error suspected in Korean Airlines' bad course. Now, they're trying to look for something. The theory is that a one-digit 300-mile human error was made in putting the takeoff location into onboard computers. I love to update these articles because what I do is I take a hypothesis, take all the information that fits into it, and write it, put it on the air, and date it. And then after that, I wait to see if anybody can refute my original allegation a week later, a month later, a year later. And so they're floundering like for the DeLorean money and for the Korean Airline, and I enjoy it thoroughly. Another story I put on the air just 2 weeks ago was the CIA agent who said that Ronald Reagan created the incident. His name is John Keppel. Now, another story this week on the computer miscue seen in Korean disaster. And there's a quotation from the investigators in Canada looking into the Korean Airline. And they said, whatever scenario you choose, you have to conclude that the crew wasn't paying much attention. Do you believe that the president, the flyer, the pilot for the president of South Korea, and carrying the most controversial congressman that he's had in a long time, like Larry McDonald, who's close to the Korean government, that one of three of those pilots didn't want to live? And then another story came out this week, human error on Flight 7. They came to the conclusion that it was a human error, and if there was a conclusion based on this investigation from the International Civil Aviation Organization, it would undercut the Soviet contention that the airline plane was on a spy mission. It couldn't be a spy mission if a human made a mistake. Then out of Airline magazine, a listener sent me this, and I appreciate these articles. Anything you send to me, like the congressional speech of Henry Gonzalez and things out of car magazines and reports I get on DeLorean motors. And this is one on Airline magazine, and it's about the airplane going down by the pilots. And this author says, if the Japanese air defense radar saw the 747's transponder return and could report the time exactly that the plane went down, why didn't the Japanese report the airline's deviation earlier? And I wasn't sure, this author said, that the Soviets knew what they were shooting. Then it goes on to say that another idle puzzle, why are Korean airlines the only type to wander into Russia and get forced or shot down when every other airline stays clear? Then they asked the article, these are pilots, what caused the airline Flight 007 to wander so far off course? We probably will never know the reason. Now, I love that answer. The minute you get close to the real reason, whether it's who killed Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy, then we get these grandiose stories. Well, we'll never know the answer because some people are getting close. They have to tell you you'll never know. It says we'll never know the reason why, and the aviation authority said the airline's initial systems have offered theories to explain how Captain Byung In-chun managed to maneuver a 747 so far. But it says Chung made his critical error while inserting a waypoint into the 3 inertial navigation system that guided the airspace. But they wondered how in the world he could get to the wrong direction, and they gave statistics that were so outrageous that it would be almost impossible, just impossible to have the machinery go off, and they cited these figures. They said, could all 3 of the Korean Flight 007's nav systems give identical but incorrect course information? This is from the Pilot magazine on airplane pilots. The chances must be in the hundreds of millions. It could all 3 have been influenced by some surface or onboard force. The chances are be so remote they hardly deserve attention. Did the crew commit a gross programming error that went undetected for an entire 2 hours? Possibly. It doesn't fit the facts. It says radar could cross-check a mistake within minutes, and the crew was Korean, a product of a regimented society responsible not only for their lives, but Americans, and they would know. Could it have been a hijacking? The pilots asked. That's an interesting possibility. With a madman in command, Captain Chung would likely have risked interception to keep his airplane flying. Most pilots would. And he would keep a civilian passenger plane going. So my contention with the high level of sophistication of mentally programming people, and this was originally tested in Korea, in Korean hospitals and the CIA, that he didn't really know that he was going down. He went right into the clouds. And as I said before, or put in the end of that article, what's it all about, Alfie? They're trying to figure out what his last words mean that say Delta. And the editorial, there's an editorial, interestingly enough, in the newspaper this week, and the title of it is, What's It All About, Alfie? And it's about the university professors having sex with students at Berkeley. But it's an interesting thing because I took it from a song that I like, and I was describing Larry McDonald's rotten life with all these thieves and crooks and murderers and assassins and gold smugglers and drug smugglers and dictators and head of the Birch Society, and making people believe that he's one thing, leading this double or triple life and buying guns under the names of people who are dying and prescribing Laetrile when it won't cure their cancer. And when it's all over, he's dumped in the ocean, literally alone, because not one of his aides was with him. And I said, what's it all about, Alfie? And that's in the article. So that was in an editorial this week. At the end of the article, I have that. Now, a gentleman, Ernest Lefevre, wrote a story for the Washington Times one day after Larry McDonald was dead. And just as the appointments were made in South Korea, quickly after the top aides were killed in Burma, and that provocation, the excuse for that provocation, was to cut off all trade of North Korea with Burma, which they quickly were forced to do. And the provocation of the right of the 007, letting these civilians go in the ocean, got our dander up against the Soviet Union and wanted to cut off trade with the Soviet Union. And again, putting you in a mentality, you see, you have the Burma killings in South Korea right after the 2007 with the mass grieving. You have the Grenada invasion, which they planned for a long time, where they switched governments and put in a man funded by Robert Vesco and the mafia. And Sir Eric Gary is now ready to turn back, who ran his dictatorship and his mongoose squad. And then the Beirut occasion, where we bring in more fleets and more soldiers and get a real foot in the Middle East. We had 4 major provocations. Now, Mr. Ernest Lefevre, Lefever, wrote a large column for the Washington Times, which is published and owned by Reverend Moon, one day after Larry McDonald died. And it had such details in it, you wonder how he could write it in that one day. And in the article, he says the Soviets are brutal. He says it was an unprovoked destruction of a Korean plane. He said the Soviet Union is run by a scofflaw regime, SCOFFLAW. Don't hear it often. He said they're not constrained by the norms of civilized behavior. He said they have a long record of repression at home. Then he goes into Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he tells about how people who suffer in tyranny. And then he says millions of boat people attempted to flee communism. And he has a long list of charges about the world knows about the rape of Afghanistan, and we know about the victims of Yellow Rain, and we know about the plight of Poland. This is one day after Larry McDonald goes down. Now, Ernest Lefevre is on the board of the Office of Strategic Trade with Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham, who Daniel Graham works with John Reese and the late Larry McDonald of Western Gold. So Lefevre is not new to this outfit. In other words, Lefevre, who's writing this article about the Soviet Union, he's well known as a far right winger, works with Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham. And Daniel Graham works with the late Larry McDonald, who 12 days later was to appear in the Los Angeles Police Department and say why he gave a $100,000 computer to take information from the time Reagan was governor in California through those years of terror, the anti-war movement, the signing for abortions, the peace treaties, and so forth, putting that into a computer going back to the Defense Department. So Lefevre has a very tight, long article published by Reverend Moon one day after Larry McDonald went down with links to John Reese, Daniel Graham, Fritz Kramer, and Larry McDonald. So did he have foreknowledge? Did he have his little speech written? I mean, how far does this go, as I say, talking about Vietnam, the Yellow Rain, Afghanistan, Poland, and he says this brutality refers to the brutality and so forth. It is a real Cold War speech written by Ernest Lefevre, president of Ethics and Public Policy Center and co-editor of the Apocalyptic Premise, Nuclear Arms Debated. But they don't say he's also on the board of Strategic Trade with Daniel Graham and Fritz Kramer. And Mr. Reese of Western Goals was the one who works with J. Peter Grace and Otto Ambrose. And getting back, they have a goal. They work with the Galen people in Germany, the Western Goals. So Lefevre takes a provocation that serves everybody's purposes to whip up this Cold War into a hot war. Now, these interlocking things that I'm talking about are typical of California when Reagan was governor. You have to go back to those 8 years, and sometime I'll update an article in Rebel on the California violences, the Garden Plot, Ronald Reagan, the mind control at UCLA, the nuke bases I've referred to. Those 8 years were a nurturing ground. Now he's in Washington. See, he was California's problem, and California didn't expose him when he was running for governor. You all sat back and thought, well, I'm too much into my own thing, and I'm just going to eat my health foods and take my yogurt and do my yoga, and I'll be okay. It isn't that simple. As a matter of fact, there was a program with 2 men, Mr. Sagan, who does the thing on space stations, and Paul Ehrlich from Stanford. And they were saying on TV this week about the nuclear bombs, if you don't spend 10% of your time working in politics or working for peace, you're not going to live long. This was literally, it was a CNN, an interview of 2 men who helped them build bombs, helped them build space stations, went the establishment route all the way, and then finally said, if you're a person who cares, if you have children, parents, family, friends, any kind of reality, fight this thing now and spend your time doing it. Well, our time is up now. This is KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. It's Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. And in the meantime, until Paul isn't coming in with the music, so we'll do a little bit of, here's somebody. Here's a crew for fundraising. You guys around the team is all here, and they're ready to come in. Did you get any calls? I told them not to call for the hour. Well, we're on now. I want that you all. Now you can send your checks and interrupt anybody else's program but mine and send the money. And they'll be in the other room to take the calls. And I'll be back with you next week. Bye-bye.
Oh, thanks very much, Mae Brussell. Oh, what a pleasure. What a pleasure to listen to that lady, I'll tell you. And she walks out of the room, and what happens? The telephone rings. My golly. Probably CIA chasing her down or something.
What'd you say? What'd you say there? I missed that
I said it was probably the CIA calling you.
You want to come to the house.
Okay. Come and get your famous stew. Potluck dinner there. Oh, boy. What a pleasure to have her here.